Okay, guys, I'm actually have my camera on, but this is part two of the most common pro choice fallacies that you'll hear. So this is going to have three, um, you know, fallacies, and I had to dig deep in what are the most common ones I found. So, number one is a non sequitur, right? So, non sequitur just means it doesn't follow, right? The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. I'll give you an example. So I was on Stitches Live the other day, and he had a prompt that says, yes, 13-year-old girls should be forced to give birth, right? And somebody came up to the panel, oh, you support rape, right? Because of that, because you won't allow a 13-year-old girl to get an abortion. Now, of course, I agree with his prompt. That's a story for another day. But that is an example of a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. How do you get the conclusion that because he doesn't think a 13-year-old girl should get an abortion, therefore he supports rape? That's a non sequitur. How do you get that conclusion? That's like saying the sky is blue, therefore my car is orange. How does that follow? It doesn't follow. There's many examples of this. When you hear these people speak, right? So it's probably one of the most common fallacies, other than the special pleading and the ad hominem fallacy. Now the second one is the second most common is the circular reasoning, specifically question begging. So question begging basically, your conclusion is baked in one of your premises, right? So a very common example is like consciousness, right? Question begging is a person says consciousness is what gives you moral consideration. Now, why does being conscious give you moral consideration? And here's where it goes into circular reasoning. Let's go to another example. Viability, right? Why does viability, again, they'll say, well, abortion should be cut off after viability. Okay. Why does viability grant you moral consideration? Well, because you're able to survive outside the womb. Well, you just restated what viability is. Basically, what you're saying, we know what viability is. We want to know, why does it grant you moral consideration? Why does being able to survive outside the womb mean we can't kill you, right? It's circular. Basically, you're saying viability matters because viability matters. That's literally circular reasoning. You're ending with what you started with, right? You're starting with the conclusion that you're trying to get, right? So you're saying because of just because being viable grants you moral consideration because you're viable is literally circular reasoning. Why is being 6 feet tall grant you moral consideration? Because you're 6 feet tall. That's why. It sounds stupid. Why does having black hair grant you moral consideration? Because you have black hair. So that's why it's very, very common. I think viability is one of the worst pro-choice arguments because of that reason. It is circular. It goes in a circle. Last is probably I was originally, when I thought about this, I thought it was going to be the hasty generalization fallacy. But I'm going to tuck that in for another video. I think it's the anecdotal evidence fallacy. So anecdotal evidence, so there's two types of evidence, main types. There's empirical, which is data and statistics. And then there's anecdotes, like personal stories, right? Now, anecdotes, there's a time and a place for them. I'm not saying we shouldn't have personal stories, right? Because abortion is a very personal topic, and many of these topics are. But I guess in most cases, especially in my panel, especially on TikTok, they're off limits a vast majority of the times, especially if you're using them for an argument. And like I said, I'm going to save the hasty generalization fallacy for another video, but is baked into there. Basically, the reason why you don't use a anecdote, for many reasons, but here's the main reason. You don't use it because it can go into a hasty generalization. You're essentially saying, now I'm not saying all people who do this, but a lot of people who do. You're saying that because this happened to you, somehow a vast majority of people, this is the case for a vast majority of people, that's where it becomes a hasty generalization fallacy. I would say many anecdotes, some people are making it up just by hear about it, right? You know, you don't want to dox yourself. I don't know why you would want personal information about yourself on the internet. I don't know why. And of course, it's very emotional, right? I also don't want to hear how people justify killing their babies because that's what they do. The reason why they use this is a rationalization. They're trying to justify the action that they did because people have, I forget the statistics specifically, but it's like 1 in 4 women have had at least one abortion. So that's a lot of women, and there's women who have had multiple abortions. So, clearly, they're trying to justify and rationalize this case, right? It is a very, very common fallacy, and nobody should use it. There's a time and place for it, but this is not the time and place for it. So that's my piece there.